Hi, this is Paul. The sound should be much better. There's always a little setting I have to check, and if I forget to check it, then if I've been Zooming or live streaming, the sound can be low, and it can be a problem. The sound should be better. I want to continue on the emergent movement. I'm kind of surprised. Well, I am and I'm not surprised at the response that the last video got. Got a pretty healthy response. It should get a healthy response, because I don't think we can understand our current moment and sort of the ortho surge that we're seeing now without understanding the emergent movement in the late 90s and early aughts, and it kind of peters out in the teens. And it probably, really set me up for what I would do in the early teens with my blogging, and then to find Jordan Peterson, and then for all of the things that are going on now. Now, last year, January 29, 2024, there was a group doing this emergent podcast called Emerged. And I found that podcast again through Richard Beck's excellent blog series on the death of the emergent church. I put all the links to that blog series in the links in the notes to the previous video, and it's a fast read. It's definitely worthwhile reading, and a lot of the ideas I got from the last video I got from there. Now, this emerged podcast was supposed to be something along the lines of the J.K. Rowling podcast or the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Tried to hit sort of that peak podcasting moment, highly produced. It didn't get that famous. I didn't hear about it until, of course, I found Richard Beck's. I don't even know how. It was just on Substack, one of those little things below Death of the Emergent Movement. I thought, ooh. And I read the first one, which was the last one. I thought, oh, this is completely relevant to what's going on now. And so I've been listening. I haven't listened to the entire series, but I listened to some of it. It's interesting. I was getting some fun texts from CW, who lives in Minneapolis. Minneapolis is a super important place in terms of cultural Christianity in North America. You both have sort of Doug Pageau, which was very close to CW's house, apparently. And CW didn't even know that the church went away and folded. And that's sort of the case of many of these emergent churches. The movement sort of evaporated as it sort of got merged with the mainline church and their ongoing free fall. And of course, there's the Young, Restless, and Reformed, and of course you've still got Mark Driscoll out in Arizona doing whatever the heck he's doing. So I thought it might be good to sort of listen with one of these podcasts and make some comment on it. And so I listened to a few of them, and the third one struck me as really important. I think the podcast is uneven. I think perhaps the creator of the podcast is a little too close to the material, perhaps to sort of afford the kind of perspective on it, and that's part of why I'm picking it up. But even some of the, again, this gets into the J.K. Rowling podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Justin Brierley, in some ways, is trying to, catch that wave too with his podcast on the surprising rebirth of God. So it's highly produced, but there's a ton of really important source material that I think has been quite nicely put into this podcast. And so someone clearly did a lot of the legwork to run down a bunch of this material and get some of these moments, even though, as a number of the comments in my video showed, there are a lot of elements in this podcast that weren't taken in. So let's just jump in and hear some of the stuff.
Got a Guinness in one hand, a pipe in the other, and you can see all the modern church's problems so clearly.
So a Guinness in one hand. There was one of our church plants that was doing pints and pipes, and this, in terms of the history of the Christian Reformed Church, was also part of the movement of the young, restless, and reformed into the Christian Reformed Church that really set up the big events for Synod 2022, 2023, and 2024, where same-sex marriage was basically stopped. And right now in the Christian Reformed Church, there's sort of a calving off of the left in the Christian Reformed Church. So while a lot of emergent churches and leaders, like if Rachel Held Evan had continued to live, she had already moved towards the Episcopalian Church. They sort of were making their move to the Episcopalian Church, but I don't know if it's still the case that overall the Orthodox Church is in decline. And I remember when Ready to Harvest did their video on the Orthodox Church, and he had said that overall their numbers are in decline because, of course, you've got this massive civilizational Orthodox immigrant group who are sort of secularizing and deconstructing in the West, while you've got sort of this new ortho-bro movement where things are coming up. Whether that movement will be big enough to offset the overall decline, the same thing is happening. The same thing happened with the absorption of the emergent into the mainline. The mainline numbers are just so enormous that even if they get that boost from the progressives in the emergent movement, that's not going to arrest the just catastrophic collapse of that church. And of course, some will debate that church. I just recently saw a Substack which wrote about the Anglican Church in Canada and its collapse. So numerically, it is collapsing. How far will it go down? I don't know. Will there be something that survives? I don't know. Of course, Redeemed Zoomer is sort of betting that at some point it'll hit low enough that the holdouts can capture the institution and reform it and write it up. Maybe. But what happened in the Christian Reformed Church is that we did get a decent number of people who were very much young, restless, and reformed, and there was enough assimilation in the CRC that they could move into the CRC. There was some in the RCA, but because of the polity structure of the RCA, when they tried to sort of do what happened in the CRC to the RCA, the polity wasn't the same, and they really couldn't do much with Synod, and so the RCA has been cratering. And while they had, really tried to grow through various means in the Reformed Church of America, seeker methodology, young, restless, and reformed methodology, when politically and structurally they couldn't really sort of get a handle on the main line east, there was the abandonment of the denomination, and it's shrunk in just astronomical terms in the last 5 years. But this opening up of, so you've got this opening up to tobacco and alcohol that you saw in the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement. I mean, this was a departure from fundamentalism, teetotaling fundamentalism. And a denomination like the Christian Reformed Church, that was always quite Dutch. While there were elements in the Christian Reformed Church, for example, my grandmother had a brother who was an alcoholic, so she was a teetotaler. My grandparents didn't drink. Generally speaking, a Christian Reformed council room in the 50s and 60s and then into the 70s would have been a smoke-filled room. It wasn't unusual if you were visiting a Christian Reformed church to see a whole bunch of CRC men standing out on the church smoking cigarettes outside the church. Now, evangelicals who would come in would see that and be aghast, and then they'd learn that Christian Reformed people drank alcohol too, and so you had this conflict. I remember hearing stories coming out of the seminary in the 80s and 90s where you had Korean Presbyterians coming into the United States studying because, gaining degrees, going to seminary, and just aghast that they would find their professor in his office smoking a pipe. Use of tobacco and use of alcohol. CRC synods, there was always a joke that Calvin campus, which was ostensibly a dry campus, no alcohol allowed, but if you would go there during synod, synodical delegates would have parties with alcohol in their dorm rooms. And of course, the joke in the Christian Reformed Church was that these were Canadian Bible studies. Pete Van de Beek and the CRC Voices live stream Friday made that joke. So right there, you see a change where these fundamentalist evangelical prohibitions on tobacco and alcohol get loosened. That's sort of seen as, this is old legalism. In our cluster meeting today, we had quite a vigorous conversation about Sabbatarianism and the role that this played in the Christian Reformed Church. So my wife was, her family in Grand Rapids, they were Baptist. They were fundamentalist Baptist. And of course, living in Grand Rapids, they knew the Christian Reformed Church. They had family members who were in the Christian Reformed Church, family members who were Baptist. The Baptist wouldn't touch alcohol or tobacco, but they could do anything they wanted on Sundays, go shopping or swimming or anything. And they looked over at the CRC as, a little bit legalistic and crazy for all their Sabbatarian rules. Whereas the CRC people would look over at the Baptists and say they were a little legalistic and crazy for their ideas about alcohol and tobacco, but then they were also the kind of people who would go spend money on Sunday. And go out to eat on Sunday. How worldly of them. So you had all of these kinds of things. And so part of the emergent movement, which even stuck in with, let's say, the young, restless, and reformed, who were fine going to pubs and drinking pints and having tobacco, that was a new liberation. You wouldn't think about young, restless, and reformed in terms of a liberationist motif, but that was a new liberation for the young, restless, and reformed. They would do alcohol and tobacco while the others, while their parents and grandparents wouldn't.
Or something. So that was my claim to fame. At one point, I almost killed Dave Crowder.
You've got a Guinness in one hand, a pipe in the other, and you can see all the modern church's problems so clearly through those rose-colored diesel glasses of yours. Buffet of all things postmodern.
And again, one of the things that came through in this podcast is just the celebration of postmodernity. Now, let's say in the Peterson sphere, you won't see that celebration of postmodernity, even though, as my friend Damien Walter continues to point out, he says, "Yeah, but is Peterson really not postmodern?" And this is where, when we get into these fringe layers like postmodern or metamodern, or we're right now in territory where naming that hasn't actually been fully mapped yet.
They had a deep suspicion of hierarchy and institutionalism.
If fear is the motivation behind not dealing with those sort of in the back of your mind questions, that to me is the worst kind of faith of all. It's despair.
So there's Brian McLaren, key figure in the emergent movement. Rachel Held Evans, I believe that's Rachel, key figure in this movement. Now also notice the sensibility, because the emergence very much went ancient modern. Now again, this is why I see the Orthodox moment, this Orthodox moment. And again, when I say moment, I'm not trying to dismiss them, because of course the Orthodox are planning on centuries. But this uptick towards orthodoxy. I was just watching Christian Baxter talk to Jared the Atheist, and of course Jared the Atheist goes to a bunch of these churches and just can't stand them. But Jared the Atheist goes to an Orthodox church and gives it a great review. And again, in many ways, Jared the Atheist is very much in this flow. And Jared the Atheist, who is it comes through very clear in Christian Baxter's conversation, very much a nihilist. And you can find Jared the Atheist in his conversation with me on my channel. So this movement is this movement set up where we are today. And so it's helpful to take a step back and ask, okay, what were they doing? What were they thinking? And why did it sort of train wreck the way it did?
Welcome to Emerged, a story of young leaders who had audacious dreams, who became loyal friends, who achieved fame and influence, who burned brightly but briefly. And now, for the first time, many of the leaders reflect on their participation in the emerging church movement, and they consider the movement's legacy. Join us as we tell the tale of their successes and failures, the attacks they endured, the mistakes they made, what they left undone, and what they accomplished. Join us.
Now, another one of the subsequent episodes where there was sort of the episode focused on pushback, and they'd have some of these leaders, and it was very interesting because the leaders weren't as much defensive in some cases as dismissive, which I found to be really interesting because, well, so one of the things that you have to figure out how to deal with when you're when you step into a public forum in a contentious area like religion is you're going to be criticized, you're going to be outright attacked in some cases, and you're going to have to figure out what to do with it. And there's no one answer. And you're basically going to have to decide what to do with different people based on who you are. And that will tell a lot about you. And the same is true of me. So it's very interesting, sort of, because the people who participated in this are not dead, most of them. Most of them are still around, and they've gone on to other things. Or maybe they've gone on to nothing. Or it's very interesting. I noticed this when I was doing that dive into the Jesus movement, the Jesus revolution, and sort of the Jesus people movements that went through in the 60s and 70s, where a bunch of those people are still around too, of course. In fact, we did Dog Bark passed away, and we had a little brief service at the cemetery for Dog Bark. And what was fun is that there were some of his old friends who were there who knew him before he became a Christian. They all talked about BC, and they're all sort of in the same group. And it was very interesting because many of these individuals, their stories were just straight out of something like the Jesus Revolution. The stories were the same. The patterns were the same.
To hear the story of what emerged. And now, here are your hosts, Tony Jones and Trip Fuller, with producer Josh Gilbert.
I wanna find my way back home.
Oh, I hope this music doesn't wreak havoc with the algorithm.
I wanna learn to love, and I want to be known. We're doing things a little differently in this episode. Before we get to our introduction with Josh and Trip, we left last episode and there was an elephant in the room.
And then one night, Mark and Grace and Lynette and I were out for dinner and had a lovely evening. And we were driving back Mark was driving us back to our car. And I literally opened the door, had one foot on the curb and one foot in the car, and he leaned over.
We have to deal with that elephant. I guess dispose of that elephant. The voice you're hearing is Dwight Friesen. Dwight is a professor at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology now, but at the time he was a church planter in Seattle. He had planted a church called Quest. And he and Mark Driscoll were talking about merging their churches into one church and co-pastoring that one church. So let's go back to this story that Dwight is telling about the night that the two couples went out for dinner.
And he leaned over and he was like, so just so we can be clear on the role of women in ministry. And it's like, it was like the deal was off. It's like immediately I knew that this partnership could go no further. That was the first sign that I had that he was in a very different place theologically.
After the big Glorieta conference in 1998.
Now, Driscoll, so previous episode had talked a lot about Driscoll, and Driscoll is a very interesting character in this, but that's going to show one of the questions here in terms of, okay, women in ministry, how does this work? And a lot of the emergents were like pro women in ministry, of course. A lot of them were against. So then there you have the cleavage of the young, restless, and reformed. And then, of course, that made the entrance into the Christian Reformed Church of some young, restless, and Reformed pastors interesting because, okay, well, how's this going to work in the CRC? Obviously, LGBTQ questions, those are going to come later, but those are going to be formative in this. So you can see in the emergent movement, many of the things that would come later already playing out. Oh, and now it quits.
What we called the regional forums, and there were several all around the country. And there was one that took place in Seattle that was hosted by Mark Driscoll. It was at Seattle Pacific University. And something happened at that regional forum in Seattle that led to the end of the relational connection between Mark Driscoll and the rest of us who went on to found Emergent Village and be part of the emerging church movement. Dwight Friesen was in the room when it happened.
I went to a session. I'm pretty sure Mark was leading it, but he was in the room, and this is when he kind of blew up. And I just remember here we'd been having all these generous conversations at all of the events leading up to this, and this one for sure. And there was a spaciousness, and I ran a quality to the way people were connecting. They were sharing resources. There was a generosity. It was ecumenical. Like there were folks from all kinds of different Christian traditions, and yet we were finding a way to connect with each other and learn from each other, and it was beautiful. And then I think it was a woman who challenged something that Mark was saying, and he just erupted. I just remember I was sitting probably 6 or 8 feet away from him, and he got right in the person's face and was like pointing his finger and screaming at the person. And it just, all of a sudden, it put this giant question mark in the room. Like, what are we doing? I thought this was a conversational space that invited us to wonder and to imagine, like, what if we operationalize the way of Christ in a more generative way with one another? And this felt very different. The whole event pivoted, I would say, from then on. Like, I mean, not everybody was in the room, but the ripple effects of that explosion raised a question as to what is this thing about? I just remember the feeling afterward. And there was just this sense of shock and like, what happened? And it was this profound sense that kind of conversation did not belong, that it didn't fit here. It was out of place.
So there you have a boundary, and you have it, it's not, obviously it will come, there will be theological expression to that boundary, but it wasn't just that, let's say, Mark Driscoll disagrees with the role of women in ordained ministry. It's how he behaved. And when I look, for example, at the Christian Reformed Church now, that's where, I can really see some of the differences. That many of the young conservative clergy that, let's say, maybe or may not, I'm not going to name names, or you're restless and reformed, you're not. But what's interesting about this younger generation from, let's say, older generations that I knew, were that they're comfortable working with women, even if they disagree with women in ministry, and they generally, not all, but generally know how to behave in a space like that. In other words, they can have their differences, but they're not going to be combative. Now, is that winsome? Is that a squish? There are all these subtle differences in this. I really should test if this video is going to even make it into the algorithm on YouTube.
Dwight wasn't the only person who felt that Mark Driscoll did not belong. And I think even Mark Driscoll felt that. It was shortly thereafter, probably sometime in the year 2000, on a phone call that included several people, Mark went his own separate way from the rest of us. Focused his time and energy not only in his own church, obviously, but also in the Acts 29 network, as opposed to what became the network of Emergent Village.
And again, I think you're going to see then, would you think of Tim Keller as emergent? Would you think of John Piper as emergent? Probably not. But elements of that emergent, then eventually you're going to have the Gospel Coalition, you're going to have Acts 29, you're going to have this young, restless, and reform movement, and they're going to take off, and they're very much going to be separate from the emergent, and they're going to separate over an issue like women in church office.
So, my friends, that is the last time you're going to hear about Mark Driscoll on this podcast.
And even there, it's sort of like you almost get a vibe of he who shall not be named. We're not gonna name Mark Driscoll because that might be just triggering for you, precious, fragile podcast listeners.
On with the show.
There are two parts of the shift out of Leadership Network. One is a shift from a community of practitioners and leaders to a community that now has some definition that are getting amplified, wrestling with what it means to be a brand, experimenting with style in a larger evangelical kind of church marketplace.
Okay, now at this point in their story, Church Leadership Network is still taking sort of the seeker approach that Willow Creek had. It's like, hey, we know how to evangelize them. The nugget, the kernel of the gospel will stay the same. We'll just change the embroidery around it. Now those young people, they have like all this postmodernity and stuff, and that just looks different. So we'll change the embroidery around it. But once we sort of get that tuned in, then everything will sort of follow like it did with the Seekers. And of course it doesn't. And very quickly they begin to learn that not only doesn't it work in terms of the youth that are out there, but they have a leadership problem in that their leaders are no longer what they were before.
Marketplace. And all of a sudden, this group of friends that are practitioners sharing junk in more private, intimate spaces get handed a microphone when thousands of ministers get together and when thousands of youth ministers get together.
But by prayer and petition, with a heart of thanksgiving, present your request to God. Present your request to God.
I will say that in 2000...
Now it's... Oh, shoot. Why do you keep doing that? In... Like even just that little musical interlude, that sounds more like Jesus Revolution than Third Day. And so you can see these various strains just sort of intermingling. And of course, Jesus movement is going to be very biblicistic. It's going to be rather charismatic. It's going to have those elements, but you've also got certain liberationist elements in there. And you just sort of see this DNA working through and working through and working through. And you just can pick up sensibilities in terms of the music as well.
2000, where this episode begins, we had no idea. We had no idea anything that was going to happen in the next 5 years. We got cut loose by Leadership Network, and then I fly to Maryland and sleep on Brian McLaren's couch for a week with a few other people, and we try to figure out, are we going to form a nonprofit? Are we going to...
And this is, again, part of what's different is that this was a movement that was paid for. This was a movement that was supported by evangelical money. And when certain things get transgressed and the money gets cut off, well, now they need to know what to do. And that also sort of shows why they went to the main line, because this movement was used to getting paid. Now, a lot of more sketchy movements aren't used to getting paid. And there wasn't sort of a social media platform that could fund this stuff. You know, part of what's interesting about the kinds of movements we see happening today is that they're paid by YouTube. They're paid by advertising dollars. You have Patreon and YouTube membership, and you have all of these other ways of sort of getting a movement going and paying for it instead of just through donations from churches that maybe are sort of trusting and drowsy and don't really know what's going on. So I'm sure they're doing good work. So go continue about your business.
I'd file for 501c3 status and start taking donations. Like, who are we and what are we going to do? It didn't feel like the evangelical church was handing us the microphone and saying, we really care about what you have to say. It more felt like we were scratching and clawing to figure out who we were and what was the next step.
Around my time when I first heard about the emergent movement, this is like 2008. So this is, we're definitely years before that. But I'm going to local bookstores and I'm seeing there's like a progressive section. I don't think it's called that, but there's like those books, maybe Brian McLaren. It's big enough that it's entering my evangelical upbringing. It's big enough to be like
and oh shoot, here we go again. Again, notice this movement rode the back of evangelical publishing. Now, if I go and I dig up those books that I bought in the late 90s, early aughts, that were the Brian, the McLaren books and all of this, and look at who published them. Now, it's also important to recognize that part of what, and I should probably have somebody on, because this story isn't well told. So you've got publishers like Baker and Zondervan and Erdman. I think Erdman is still independent, but Zondervan gets bought out by major publishers. Why? Because any publisher that has a Bible, and the NIV was an enormously popular Bible. The NIV made Zondervan's a very attractive corporation to be pawed out. And so they could have this little religion section there at Zondervan's and sort of leave them alone, have them do their thing. Because that sales of the NIV and all the different ways you could repackage the NIV, I mean, that was for publishing at a time when publishing was getting disrupted because of the internet. That was a huge deal. And so, publishing is still disrupted, and it's not quite clear what's going to happen with publishing. I mean, eventually it's disrupted by Amazon and self-publishing and all kinds of things. But there's a lot moving at this point, and I haven't sort of taken the emergent movement and set it up next to Phil Vischer. And of course, if you read, was it Larry Bob and I? If you read Phil Vischer's book, which is a great book, if you read Phil Vischer's book, he tried to move from VHS to DVD and then do a movie that would be in theaters. This moment now that The Chosen has sort of spurred, anytime there's a particular element of American Christianity that really catches marketing fire, it's like the great eye of Sauron of Hollywood and publishing looks at it and says, I want to do that too. I want to be successful like The Chosen or like the NIV or like something like that. If there's money to be made, they'll go trotting after it.
Threat, and I'm starting to hear about it. After Glorieta, there's obviously a buzz. There's 450 people there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But it then, in this episode, we'll see it grow to be much bigger and to
10 times that. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, little things happen that you'll hear about in this episode, but other things happen that we'll talk about in future episodes, like theological conversations that a couple hundred people would go to and spend 3 days with, premier globally renowned.
And again, there's one of the big shifts from the seeker movement to the emergent movement, because the seeker movement basically said, we're not going to talk about theology. We're not going to go there, because once we go there, sort of the neo-evangelical agreements start to break down. And so the seeker methodology was, we're going to do everything in a different way, and the message will be the same. So it doesn't matter if you're Baptist or Reformed or, Catholics can do this or that anybody can do this. You just need sort of take down the crosses, have a plain house, have a big stage, have music that's tuned into the radio preferences of your target audience, basically have a monoculture group, especially with respect to music, to the degree that you can, and maybe have skits and drama and a little bit of art and some of those things, but then basically you hit them with a message pretty similar to what Billy Graham would have delivered.
Renowned theologian. We had a lot of meetings and gatherings, like Asbury Seminary brought us in for a thing we called WALP, the Worship and Arts and Liturgy Project, WALP. And that was...
So again, now arts are going to come into this because arts are sort of where Protestants really fear to tread often, not always. I was just looking at Justin Brierley's little tweet thread where he's got, you get some really beautiful Protestant churches in Europe. But in America, if you go to Willow Creek, as many, I remember going there and someone saying, yeah, this looks like a community college. And yeah, they're sort of right.
Like put on by Asbury Seminary, but it was all emergent people who were all the speakers and the conference leaders and everything. Look, nobody in 99 or 2000 was putting us on the main stage in front of 5,000 youth pastors. But by 2005, 2006, yes, we were like in the mix of that kind.
Okay, and another key element of this is that this grows out of what became youth ministry in the seeker movement. Pizza and games just sort of got amplified, and youth specialties, there's the title. And other groups just began to sort of hone in youth ministry. And once, youth ministry, so you sort of go from the ball pit to the fun and games to, well, then church kind of looks sort of boring and adultish. And what if church was consumeristic and fun too, and artsy and had the feels? And instead of, again, remember the title of Molly Worthen's book about neo-evangelicalism is The Apostles of Reason.
Kind of thing.
Who I was and what I had to believe.
I think one of the things that I've long thought about the emergent movement is that there were really two streams. There was the stream of people who wanted to change the way that church was done in the evangelical world. And then there was a stream of people who were brought into this because they were really interested in the ideas of the philosophy and the theology. I'm definitely of the latter stream because I came from a more mainline context. I got turned on to postmodernism in seminary. I think like the poster child for the first stream was Dan Kimball, who really was doing like very radical things out of the church within a church model that he was working on, and ended up writing multiple books, including books with Emerging Church in the title. And I would say in this era of 2000 to 2005, those two streams still got along really well. And especially at the conventions. And one interesting thing about this episode, we're not really going to talk about who was up on stage giving the talks at those three conventions. We're going to talk about like the vibe and the aesthetic, because I think it's really interesting, the vibe and the aesthetic that was so un-pastors convention like.
See? I mean, you can feel people go into an Orthodox church. It's the vibe and the aesthetic. Now, eventually, they may or may not get really excited about the theology. It seems there's a certain flexibility. I mean, every place has flexibility in some things, more rigidity in other things. I mean, that's the whole point of how we manage, again, the epistemic revolution that's underway, how we manage a world too big. All of theology is too much to know or look for, so people tend to pick their points. Maybe it's women in office, maybe it's LGBT, maybe it's the Trinity, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's this. Now you can have a cluster of them. One of the things that I noticed when churches first started putting up websites, that was during sort of the seeker movement, and what you saw was that probably, who knows who was actually making the website for the church, but these church, and it's still true today, what do we believe pages it was like 10 or 11 broadly evangelical points about the Trinity, about the Bible as the Word of God, may or may not say much about baptism, but 10 or 11 points. And I'd find churches across the denominational spectrum just cutting and pasting the same point, page after page after page. Now, it's interesting in the Christian Reformed church fight, churches that had websites with affirming statements got put under automatically limited suspension. Churches that didn't, who's to say? So now you have this element of prophylicity happening here.
And I still go to pastors' conventions, and there's still nothing like those 3 emerging conventions. Nothing like them.
Well, today is a brand new day. I'll start again.
One of the themes that runs throughout this episode are the different situations that kind of forced upon this group of friends as attention and energy is moving their way to draw boundaries. The story Dwight tells at the very beginning, I think, is really important, right? With that conflict, he says that didn't belong here. And that is an expression of patriarchy where women aren't full participants and leaders, right? We're just a year away, the launching of the emerging women's leadership group, which takes an ongoing.
Okay, so remember, again, Richard Beck's The Death of the Emergent Church. One of the things that killed it is woke. And that, patriarchy has no place here. Well, what about sexual minorities? Discrimination against has no place here. And eventually you just had the same elements that tend to destroy wokeism. Well, it kind of happened there too.
Going role and increased leadership and such. And that boundary marker of belonging, but it's a belonging where all voices, experiences are celebrated, really shifted it. There's also a boundary that
See, again, it's a boundary of belonging. So Mark Driscoll doesn't belong, but all voices. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Does all mean all? Because if all means all, then you got to kind of allow Driscoll. And this gets, I think in many ways, a lot of the observations of Jonathan Pageau are critical because these issues had to be navigated. And when you listen to a podcast like this, it's like they've never heard of Jonathan Pageau. They haven't quite wrestled with some of the pieces that, of course, get to Vervaeke and Pageau and Peterson, where some of these issues are, all voices are included, really? Well, what about that voice? No, not that voice. That voice is exclusive of all voices. So in other words, inclusivity and exclusivity and centers and fringe. Oh, there are no hierarchies here. Really? Well, why did you choose those words? And so you can very much see that a lot of the things that sort of birthed the TLC, this was allowed to happen because of Peterson and Pageau and Vervaeke and a lot of their ideas, where some of these things that the emergent church sort of bound up on, they couldn't get through.
Logical questions matter, and how you respond to them makes a difference. You'll hear Brian voice it, but that's something that came to shape the DNA of the larger emerging church movement. Aesthetics became a boundary marker, not because the aesthetics of what's happening, how art and spirituality and participation, all these things are getting used, but aesthetics is actually embodying a different way to think theologically about what it means to follow after Christ or to be.
Okay. And if you don't, you said embody, but of course that will be a piece of, well, why now? I mean, it was evangelicals dabbling with smells and bells, and then you're going to have the Anglicans and the Catholics and the Orthodox walk in and say, you're a bunch of children playing with this stuff. We've been using art and symbol and all of this for centuries. You think you can just come here and just sort of make it up as you go? Is that coherent?
Be a Christian or to talk about God and the divine in a different context. How you arrange the room matters. What pictures and images are being used. The aesthetics for some is a means to the same end. And for others, it's figuring out how to do theology when the sufficiency of language and the supremacy of the ordained authoritative clergy is out the door? What happens when the task of honoring the tradition is something we all discover together as we live together? Then...
So I just said something that the Catholics and the Orthodox will say, yay, but you hear what he just said there? Now, what's interesting, of course, is that, again, part of the current moment about Orthodoxy and Catholicism is all Orthodox, all Catholic. No, not the current patriarch in Moscow. Not him. Oh, okay. But Orthodoxy. But he's not Orthodox. Yeah, but okay. But again, even with, and of course the consternation about the current Pope in Rome. But again, you'll notice that the Tradcats and the Orthodox are very adept at picking and choosing and modulating within their boundaries their hierarchies.
You asked to fly your local street artist to a pastor's convention. One of the things Chris names that became increasingly uncomfortable for the people that in this period are platforming so many emerging church voices is Chris says, yeah, the fundamentalists kept treating the Bible like they treat their wife, coming up with new words to make sure if you're insecure about how much you love her, you give her a new superlative. And so it's the holy, inerrant, infallible word of God. And Chris kind of named at that Bible and postmodern culture event a new orientation to how one relates to the text.
So, you think all of the fights now about sola scriptura are just suddenly they just come right out of the 5th century or the 12th century or the 16th century? They're coming out of the emergent movement because this particular approach to scripture. Remember when I was talking to Nathan Jacobs and sort of the thinning out? Well, it starts to look thin, and so, but that can go different ways.
For some, that new orientation was actually a way the text became sacred again.
Now notice sacrality there is more a sensibility. It's not an argument. And of course the Catholics and the Orthodox are going to say, well, we have apostolic succession. Well, our church was here before the Bible was here. Therefore, Bible doesn't make church, church makes Bible.
Okay, fellas, you may remember that Doug Pageau was hired by Brad Smith at Leadership Network in 1997. By the middle of 1999, Doug had departed Leadership Network and moved back to Minneapolis to start the planning for the faith community that would become Solomon's Porch. So I asked Brad Smith to go back in time to 1999 and what led up to Doug leaving and ultimately to the rest of us leaving Leadership Network.
I probably have to have an ad in here or something. So, okay, get to the point.
A role of a staff person at Leadership Network is to be behind the scenes and support. We, quote unquote, control what's happening by who we put on stage and who we don't put on stage. That is not Doug. And I don't know that I understood that when we hired him. Doug wants to be on stage and should be on stage. That's his gift. And so that created some tension inside of Leadership Network. I've been challenged, and perhaps I didn't put enough control on that. It was more that he had more of a strident tone that did create some relational issues inside of leadership.
Now, a lot of corporate speak here, huh? I mean, this is the way you hear, let's say you go, so-and-so gets fired from their job, and then you're going to go talk to the supervisor as to why they let him go, and you don't want any problems with HR, you don't want any defamation lawsuits, you don't want anything like this. And so there's a certain corporate speak to say, well, you spend more time with his family, we had differences of vision. And I'm not saying none of that was true. But it's the corporate speak that's important here because, again, I remember when it was before I came to Living Stones, I was talking to a church. It's actually Jonathan Dunk's church. and I remember I was coming back from the Dominican Republic, and I got the question, do you think church should be run as a business? And I'd grown up in church. I'd been a foreign missionary. I'm now kind of coming back to North America. And I get that question, and I was like, a cow stares at a new gate. It's like, church run as a business? It's like I didn't understand the question. It was the first time I had ever heard anything framed in that way. And it's like, I don't even remember what I said, because it was just like, but that was the seeker movement. We're going to apply business tools. We're going to apply psychology. We're going to apply sociology. And we're going to have the gospel, which doesn't change. We're just going to present it in a different way. And then, boom, spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down.
Leadership Network. As I got to know Doug and came to love him, it helped me to explain to people, this is who Doug is. And there's some value in that, and there's some really important reasons why perhaps he's going to be very important to this network. Often when he would do things that would offend people, there's a part of that I recognize that's who God made him. He's probably not taking himself quite as seriously as people think he is, right? And there's an entertainment moment there that he understands and gets, and he does. I got a lot more complaints about Doug than I ever got about Mark Driscoll.
Okay, that is really the last time you're going to hear the name Mark Driscoll on this podcast.
I mean,
I think what
you get the sense that these people are still sore. These people are still sore because for a while they thought they were inheriting the kingdom. For a while, and in a sense, they sort of bought. They were sort of bought the whole seeker idea that we're the next generation. We're the ones that are going to turn this around. We're going to plant new churches. We're going to call them Solomon's Porch. We're going to call them Jacob's Well. We're going to call them all of these sort of, So again, the seeker movement sort of had secularized names: Willow Creek, Saddleback. The emergence. Well, let's find the vibey. Let's find the vibey church, Solomon's Porch. It's all about discussion. Mars Hill, Jacob's Well, Living Stones. And let's take that and have that be the vibe. And Jacob's Well and Solomon's Porch and Mars Hill, they'll be the new Willow Creek. And it didn't happen.
What happened with Doug is he kind of looked around and realized, I think I would like the church plant. We get that. And so he was not forced out, for sure. But he also recognized, I think we all recognized this was not his dream job. And it was time for him to move on, and we got that. It was mutual, not in a negative way, but mutual. We go, yeah, there probably is a need for somebody else, and there's probably a need for you to do something else, only because that's your calling and your giftedness.
I asked Doug Pageau to reflect on the end.
So that's kind of corporate church speak, and you'll get that a lot in seeker churches and big box churches. Now, part of that, again, is part of the practicality of the fact that if you have a church of thousands of people, you're going to have to run it by certain norms, and it's probably, especially for Protestant churches, going to sort of look like a corporation. Now, the Roman Catholic Church with the pedophile priest scandal has had a lesson in, okay, well, these are the norms, and you'd better you'd better have your employees not do certain things, or you can wind up in the courts and you can lose a lot of money. And so, but of course, the Roman Catholic Church is just existing on an order of magnitude greater than any of these individual Protestant churches.
On the end of his time at Leadership Network as well.
It became apparent to me that Leadership Network was less interested in the direction we were going. Early on, the idea was go find creative innovators, don't have an agenda. This was Bob Buford's kind of take, and say this is how the church ought to be. Bring together church leaders, find out from best practice practitioners what they're doing, and then amplify that. But don't flavor it. The story of the organization was that's what we do. All of us on the inside, like anybody in any organization, know, well, the people you invite and the topics you pick, and that does flavor it. But it became pretty clear that a number of us had an other project that was more interesting. What was the influence of postmodern culture on society? I did want to organize people and did want to bring people together, but I wanted to do that as a co-participant in that project and not just as a convener.
Just as a reminder, Leadership Network was a foundation based in Dallas that served pastors and church leaders by bringing them together to learn, the tricks of the trade from each other, what was working and what wasn't working. And it was under their auspices that Young Leaders Network was founded.
Okay, see, seeker methodology. What works and what doesn't work, these aren't theological issues. Practices aren't theological issues. What works and doesn't work, these are methodological issues to deliver the message. The message is in this little Amazon box. It's in this little pill, spoonful of sugar. Got to get the message in. Once you get the message in, Holy Spirit comes in, whoop, off you go. And, well, the emergents begin to look at this like, really? That doesn't seem right. Now, you get to a point now, and anybody who sort of says that today, they're still saying it today, but just not going to fly the way it flew in 1995 or 2000, because of a lot of these developments.
Founded by Brad Smith and then directed by Doug Pageau. And then Doug left Leadership Network in 1999 and moved back to Minnesota to plant Solomon's Porch. And shortly thereafter, the relationship between all the rest of us who had gathered under the Young Leaders Network and Leadership Network ended as well. So I asked Brad Smith, who was the president of Leadership Network at the time, his memories of how that relationship ended.
We very carefully did not name it anything interesting, okay? And the reason is we felt like if you brand it, it's going to have commercialization. Rather than just this free listening, exploring, you're going to start having people trying to publish stuff and write stuff and then compete with each other. So every time something came up, it was, no, let's call it Young Leaders. That's a really boring title. Brian McLaren came up with Terra Nova. I thought that's cool. And so for a long time, that was kind of the brand. But by that time, it already had brand, it had momentum, people writing books about it. And I think Leadership Network felt like it could spin off without being lost. So most of the reason was about transitions inside of Leadership Network, including me leaving. I didn't hear hardly anything about theology. That wasn't really the reason from my viewpoint.
Bob Buford was there, and he asked if he could meet with me, and he'd sat in on one or two of the talks that I gave at that large conference.
That's Brian McLaren. You may remember him from the last episode, and you're probably familiar with Brian and his books and his speaking. Brian told me about a conversation he had with Bob Buford, who founded and funded Leadership Network. So was, I guess, in essence, Brad's.
Okay, so now we have the patron here. Okay, This is the guy who's funding it. And again, this is an evangelical approach to going about business. He's not funded by the Archdiocese of New York or by an ecclesiastical operation. Evangelicalism is individual initiative, entrepreneurial, all of that.
Smith's boss, the one who held the purse strings of Leadership Network. Brian was speaking at a big conference called Off the Map, and he ended up sitting down with Bob Buford at that conference.
I don't think I'd ever met Bob Buford before, but we met for breakfast, and you know, I liked him. He was a quirky guy, obviously a very generous guy. But we're sitting at breakfast, and he said, "You guys keep talking about theology." I said, "Yeah, it's really, really important to what we're about." And he said, "We don't do theology." I said, "Well, I think that's impossible. But if what you're saying is you don't want to be involved in theological conversations, you know, that's certainly not where I'm going. I think our deepest problems are theological, not just methodological." And he just gave me this look. And I wish I could remember his exact words, but he said something like, "You make no sense to me." Like that, not too many times somebody says that to your face, but he sort of, it's like, "Yeah, you make no sense to me." And I remember thinking, oh boy, I hope I didn't just blow it for Young Leader Networks, as it was called. And I think it was shortly after that they cut the funding.
So in other words, you have this evangelical structure, and they think they're doing one thing, and okay, well, let's fund this. Let's have them re-embroider the Amazon box. And no, they don't want to stay in the Amazon box. They want to talk about theology. They want to talk about this. They want to talk about that. It's interesting, he said, not just, not methodologies. And it's like, well, wait a minute. You're also going to be about, and this is when, of course, John Vervaeke comes along and he's talking about practices. And I thought, we've been talking about practices for decades, my friend. After the part of deconstructing the seeker movement was practices. And you had the ancient modern, you had all of these things flowing through. But of course, nothing sort of coalesced. And you had this big split between Young, Restless, and Reformed and the mainline. And again, but I think the warm waters of the culture that bred the emergent movement and the Young, Restless, and Reformed are also what are contributing to the Orthodox moment.
There was one final meeting in Chicago that I think finally severed the ties between, I guess we were calling ourselves the Group of 20 at the time, or maybe the Terra Nova Theology Project. These were a couple of names we were kind of bouncing around. Then there was a meeting at my cabin in 2000 where we kind of dreamed up the idea of Emergent Village. This was pre-Emergent Village, but maybe came up with that idea. We were, though, to coin a phrase, wandering in the desert, kind of trying to figure out who we were post-Leadership Network. And I think one of the things that really gave us an identity was a conference on the Bible and preaching in a postmodern society hosted by Chris C. at Ecclesia Church in Houston. The church wasn't even done being built yet. But he nevertheless hosted that conference. And it was our first real gathering, our first real event after Leadership Network without their support and help. And Brian McLaren was there. This is what he remembers of that conference.
One of the conferences that had a huge impact on me, I helped plan, was the one on the Bible. I forget what we called it in Houston. But one of our speakers was a Congolese theologian named Mabiala Kenzo. There was something that happened at that weekend that I will never forget. Kenzo and I were sitting in the backseat of a car going, I think, from a meeting to a meal or a meal to a meeting. And Kenzo is a brilliant theologian. multilingual, like so many of just the African intelligentsia, that they've had to work 10 times harder than anybody else. And his brilliance is just staggering, and insight is so profound. And he was talking a lot about the relationship between the African church and the colonial churches. And I had been doing a talk that I'd been sort of field testing a little statement. And I said to him in the back of the seat, I said, Kenzo, would you say that postmodern is postcolonial? And he, yes, that's it. And it's like, it took our sort of friendship and conversations to a new level. That's the most obvious statement now, but it was something that, I wasn't thinking that, in 1995 or 1998. So that was a powerful moment.
And here's Chris C.
So there again, you can see where this is going.
Chris C., who hosted that conference and is the pastor and founder of Ecclesia Church in Houston.
And to have all these people come from across the globe to talk about the Bible, they were amazing presentations there. And remember, that was the one that Rob Bell showed up at, and we didn't really know Rob Bell. And Rob Bell kept going I want to talk, and we're like, well, we don't have you down. He's like, but I'm Rob Bell. I want to talk. You're like, all right, well, we'll give you 5 minutes. And okay, that was pretty good. Can I have another 15? All right, you got 15. And he did that prayer shawl thing that, I'm sure he learned it from some Jewish brother somewhere, but it was great. And we loved it. And I vividly remember having this thought that one of the things that's kind of weird or flawed about fundamentalists is they have this feeling they're so proud of how much they love the Bible. It's I love my wife more than you love your wife or something. So we got to come up with a better word. It's infallibly, inerrant, whatever. And I just left going I just love the way that we talked about the Bible at that event. It wasn't with their words, they wouldn't have loved it, but I loved it. We see the Bible for what it is in a way that makes it really edifying for people to read it. And it builds people up and makes the world better. And I don't know, I left that event, and that's part of why then I dove in and spent the next 10 years doing the voice translation, because that event inspired me so much. And I just realized most people don't know the Bible's a library, and the literary styles when they're translated are so poorly done. And that was where I was I got to do that, because.
So again, you just watch this thing develop. Now, this stuff is going to get nuanced as it goes down, and you're going to watch the subsequent movements develop as they go. Well, that's about half. That's about half of this podcast. You can listen to the rest of it, and yeah, and the whole podcast. It's got what? Let's see, bunch of previews, and then they have 10 episodes. Legacy. Successive Fair. I haven't listened to that one yet, but it's very interesting because again, kind of sets up where we are today. So we'll see if the algorithm lets this video go through. I don't really want a content strike. Anyway, leave a comment.